Hi there, I'm Jennifer Tryon. Like my bag? I'm going to show you how you can make one using the Sachel dies from Gemini. Okay, so for this project I'm going to use this soft flannel plaid and the Threaders super soft faux leather. Remember, these dies can cut through many different materials. So the flannel-y plaid and the faux leather is no problem. Of course, I'm going to be using my Gemini, and I've got all of the Sachel bag making dies right here. I'm also going to use a couple of Threaders D-rings, that's to attach the straps, and a couple of the Threaders magnetic clasp fasteners, and that's going to allow me to close up my bag and keep it shut. And of course, you're going to want to have basic sewing supplies. Your sewing machine, pins, a seam ripper for when things go south, and for when you need to attach the magnetic clasp fasteners. Okay, so now that you know what we need, let's get going. So I'm going to set the dies aside for a second while I prep the fabric, because you want to cut this fabric on the fold. It's going to allow you to get a much bigger piece out of a much smaller die. So the largest die in this set makes the back bag panel, which consists of the front flap. It sort of folds over. So we're going to cut this on the fold. So I'm just lining it up to see how big a piece I really need, and then I can kind of just subcut from there. And you're going to cut all the materials in exactly the same way. The outer fabric, the stabilizer, and the lining. They all need to sandwich together. So anytime you cut one, you're going to need to cut all three. So because I'm just going through 2 layers here, the Gemini should be able to cut that without having to use the metal shim. Because this is a multimedia die, which means it's a bit bigger, deeper, stronger than a regular paper crafting die. So I want to line up my die with just the tip hanging over the edge of my material. That's going to allow me to keep this fold intact. And when that fold's intact, that means I can open it up big after it's cut. Okay, so I start with my bottom plastic plate, my fabric and my die, then my plastic shim, and my top plate. And run it through the Gemini. No cranking, no heavy lifting, and your pattern pieces are going to turn out perfectly measured every single time. Okay, so this is our main piece of our bag. So I'm just going to set this aside and cut the exact same thing out of the lining fabric and the stabilizer. Okay, so this is what you should have. So this is the back panel, the liner, and the stabilizer. The stabilizer will go in between these two. Okay, I can set these aside and cut my front. So I'll show you how to cut the stabilizer this time. It's exactly the same process. So on the fold, take my plate, even with the stabilizer, I'm gonna line up the die so it comes just slightly over the edge. I'm gonna lay down my plastic shim and my top plate. And now I know that stabilizer is gonna be exactly the same size as both my outer and my lining fabric. And there you have it. Again, perfectly cut. And just keep going with the rest of your materials. So now for your front bag panel, you should have your outer fabric, your lining, and your stabilizer. Just set them aside and keep going. The next size we have in the Sachel bag set is for the pocket. And this goes on the inside of the bag. I'm gonna cut this out of the faux leather. So you can take your faux leather, fold it over, just like you did with the bigger pieces, base plate, fabric and die, plastic shim, top plate. There you have it. I love that you don't have to rely on a pattern. You're just getting accurate cutting every single time. So the last die left to cut is this one here. And this is gonna cut the strap, the handle, and the gusset. And in case you don't know what a gusset is, it's the piece of fabric that's gonna go all around the bottom and sides of your bag. It's gonna give it that boxed out shape. So for the gusset, start with a big piece of fabric. You want the finished gusset to measure at least 23 inches. So make sure you start with more than that. And you need it to be slightly wider than the die. So I can just roughly cut that with your die facing upwards. And these little notches are your fold lines. So start at the short end of your die, slightly over, and I'm gonna fold at the first fold line. And I'm gonna fold about 5 times. And fold at the next fold line, which is right here. Because we don't want that end getting cut. We wanna maintain that fold. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it can just come off the end if you want to trim it up. Once you've got that folded, you can feel free to move it. So I'm gonna start with my base plate, my plastic shim, my die, my material, all folded, and my top plate, and then into the Gemini. Okay, and now we've got our long 23-inch piece, and that's gonna make the sides and bottom edge of our bag. All right, I'm gonna cut the handle and the strap in the exact same way. So for the handle, I'm gonna use what's left over of my leather here. You wanna make sure the handle, you have at least 6 3/4 fabric. And you'll notice with the handle, with the straps and the gusset, I'm cutting with the die facing up. Typically I cut with the dies facing down, but because I wanna see those folds, the Gemini will take it either way. And lastly, we need 4 bag tabs. So same idea, laying down the die. This time, I'm going right over the edge and I'm folding at that first fold line because these only need to be 3.5 inches. And I'm gonna do this 4 times. Okay, so let's do a little bit of inventory now that we've done all of this cutting. So you should have 3 back panels, a liner, a stabilizer, and your outer fabric. You should also have 3 front bag panels, the outer, the stabilizer, and the lining. You should have 2 pocket panels. Your gusset should be made out of the liner, the stabilizer, and your main fabric. You should have 1 strap, and you should have 4 bag tabs. Okay, it's time to sew it. Okay, we've got all of our pieces cut out. Now it's time to do a little rearranging. I'm gonna start grouping patterns together. So the plaid with the plaid, the lining with the lining, the leather with the leather. And it's gonna be important going forward to treat the lining as its own separate purse and the outer fabric and the stabilizer as one. So because I'm using an iron-on stabilizer, I'm gonna adhere these 2 together. Or you could use some stick and spray if you were using wadding or batting, but whatever you're using to stiffen up the fabric, now's the time that you'd want to adhere it. And then you're gonna treat this as one piece going forward. And typically you want to use a dry iron for this. And you're just gonna do this for every piece that needs the stabilizer. So for the bag back, the bag front, and the gusset. So just to give you an idea, the bag is actually going to look like this. And then this is actually the top fold. The front is gonna have like these little straps that come down like this. And we're gonna be using those magnetic clasp fasteners, but we can't put those on at the end. We've gotta think about that while we're still in the deconstructed phase. So it's important before you get too far into the sewing process to mark out where your magnetic clasps are gonna go on both sides of the front panel and the back panel. And this could get a little confusing because even though this big piece is the back panel, the top part is actually the front flap. And that gusset is gonna go right in the middle. So I'm gonna join the gusset to the front panel. So I'm gonna start by folding the front panel in half, just to find my middle. I can just mark that with a bit of chalk. Same with the gusset. Fold it in half and find the middle. And I'm gonna mark it with a little bit of chalk. You're gonna sew right sides together. So lining up those 2 middle marks and pin. See how it's starting to box out the bag already? Okay, that's one side done. Just gonna pin the other. Once you get it all pinned, it's going to look very strange, but that's good. It's gonna help keep it all in place. And if you have a little bit of extra gusset hanging off the end, don't worry, you can always trim that after. So I'm gonna use a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the entire thing. Go nice and slow around the curve, pulling your pins out as you go, and try not to sew over any pleats. Try to flatten those out with your fingers, even lift up the presser foot if you have to, to flatten those out. Don't forget to do a nice solid back stitch on either end because that's a pressure point in the bag. You want to make sure that's nice and sturdy. Now, just to reduce a bit of the bulk and strain, I'm going to cut a few little slits right in the corners here. So now I'm going to top stitch all along the gusset side so that this lays much flatter. So to do the top stitching, I'm actually going to use a zipper foot because it's such a tight space. That way I can get nice and close to the seam. I'm ready to attach the back panel, and find your center on your back panel and just finger press it and then mark it in chalk. And with right sides together, line up those chalk lines. And again, we're gonna do all that pinning. It's okay to flip your bag inside out and maneuver it all around so that you can get those pins in. Now it's time to sew this side, which is a little tougher because we've already got the other side on. Take off my zipper foot and stitch around the half perimeter again. So again, I'm going to snip the corners just like I did on the first side. Switch back to the zipper foot and I'm going to top stitch around the back side. The top stitching around that is tough, but just stick with it and you'll get it and you'll love the result in the end. Okay, now that we've got this top stitch down and the box of the bag is really starting to take shape, we can now start to measure out where some of the hardware may naturally need to go now that we see how it's all fitting together. So you'll remember we cut out 4 tabs. 2 are for the sides, so we can set those aside, and 2 are for the front. And they're gonna get sewn, and they're gonna kind of live somewhere on the middle here. So we need to decide where that is. And once I can feel that it's flat all the way down, it's gonna make a little impression, open it up with my seam ripper, and then I'm gonna push it in. More traditionally, the tabs would go here and it would detach on the front. I thought it would kind of look cool if the tab got moved down and it fastened onto the bottom like that. Kind of a cool look, I think. Anyway, you can do it whatever way you want. That's the beauty of making these yourself. So I'm gonna stitch this to the top of my bag. Okay, that's looking good. So now that they're on here, I'm gonna take the opposite side and attach it to the clasp. And then I'm gonna go down and measure exactly where I want it to fall on the bag. This way I know exactly where to poke it in. And I'm gonna take my seam ripper, and I'm just gonna poke 2 holes where I want the other side to go. Make sure it goes through your stabilizer on the inside and then fold down the clasps on the inside. And now all of that hardware is now on the inside of my bag, which means it won't show on the lining. Okay, I'm just gonna attach the second one. So now we've got hardware on the outside. I'm loving it already. Okay, so now I need to attach the side tabs. So now this is where you want to not forget to add your D-ring. You're gonna use 2 of them. This is really gonna make your bag look professional. So just loop in the D-ring. And now I'm gonna sew this in place with the D-ring on it. All right, that's looking really good. And the last one we need is the handle for the top. So I'm gonna take the handle and fold it in half, right sides together, and I'm going to sew along the whole raw edge. And now I've got to turn it right side out. Now I'm gonna fold over the ends and stitch a square. There's about 2 inches on either side. So with the chalk, I'm just gonna leave a little mark. And again, those seams won't show on the liner. You can see I'm going really slow here. Any of the stitching that's gonna show on the outside of the bag, I wanna be very particular about. Okay, it's so cute, but it's not done. Almost though. We now need to basically build the lining. So I'm gonna take my lining pieces, and you're gonna basically build your lining in the exact same way that you built the exterior of your bag. And then you've got your gusset piece that's gonna go all the way around, and then you've got your front panel. Now, On the inside of this bag, there's also a pocket. So I cut that out of faux leather, and I'm gonna wanna sew this to the inside of the bag. So now that I've got the top stitching on the top of the pocket, I'm just gonna go ahead and sew the whole thing to the lining, but not sew the top part here. All right, now we've got an inside pocket. It's gonna hold my phone. Now, with right sides together, I'm going to pin the gusset. A very important step that we do not want to forget here. I'm going to leave a fairly large opening so I can turn this bag right side out. So when I get to the double pins, I know to stop sewing. And this is so important because if you were to sew this shut, you're going to have no way to turn the bag right side out. So I'm going to start at that double set of pins and sew up. Now I'm going to turn my outer bag inside out, keeping all that hardware tucked in, and I'm putting the liner right side out. And now I want to put right sides together. Take a minute to make sure everything's lined up and tucked into the right spots and lining up pretty evenly. Okay, so I've now sewn the lining all the way around the flap and the opening. And now we've got that opening on the inside of the lining, remember? Now we've basically got to turn this whole thing inside out. Take the pins out of the flaps, get everything nice and rounded out. And so to keep everything lying nice and flat, I'm going to top stitch around the top flap here. So now we don't want the lining showing on the front of the bag. So this is where pressing and top stitching is really important. So just work your way around the whole flap, making sure those seams are pressed down. With it all pressed down, I'm going to top stitch across the front and around the flap. This top stitching is really making sure that the ends don't roll out or in, that everything stays nice and straight. Now we've got our long strap. This way it lays nice and flat. And I'm gonna sew another box with an X in it to really reinforce the strap. And I'm gonna do the same on the other side. Now pay attention to make sure nothing gets twisted and that your seam is on the inside of the strap. Just trim the threads and your bag is done. That's it. My satchel bag is finished. And I love that it's in this cozy plaid, which will be perfect for winter. And maybe you're not the kind of person who ever thought you'd be a good enough sewer to sew an actual bag. But the Gemini makes it easy because you don't have to cut out any pattern. And because it's so easy, you can be making bags over and over and over for every season.